Here's your Chapter 2, Section 3 presentation. In this section, we are looking at the essential question number 10, what issues and compromises were central to the writing of the U.S. Constitution? And so before we get there, we have to look at sort of the background of the people who are going to be writing, who are going to be constructing the Constitution itself. Some of the delegates meeting at the Constitutional Convention were calling for essentially a new government. And we can look at the leaders of the Virginia delegation as the leaders of that. They worked with members of the Pennsylvania delegation and a few others, but they were opposed by other delegates, including William Patterson of New Jersey, who were looking to preserve the articles and rather improve them. The convention work was conducted behind closed doors. It was absolute secrecy. In fact, only Madison's notes survived the Constitutional Convention. It was hot. They worked with closed windows. They were encouraged not even to talk about what took place in the convention hall, even with their family members. They actually had somebody babysit Benjamin Franklin to make sure that he didn't spill the beans, so to speak, in the taverns around Philadelphia. There were 55 delegates. George Washington reluctantly took the position of president of the convention to give it a sense of dignity and legitimacy. The delegates that of those 55 delegates, those delegates would become known as founding fathers. Another term that's often used, particularly in your book, is the term framers. Most of these delegates were young, with the exception, of course, of Ben Franklin, who was 81. 17 of the delegates were slave owners. George Washington was one of the biggest of the slave owners. 31 went to college, which at the time was an extraordinary percentage of any group of people. 7 of the 55 had already signed the Declaration of Independence and would eventually sign the Constitution. They brought with them their political, educational, legal, and business experience, and they wrote what truly is an exceptional constitution. A constitution is a document establishing the structure, functions, and limitations of government. Some argued that these people were motivated by economics, that they wanted a strong economy so that public debts, most of which they owned, could be paid. Others argued that it was both social and economic factors, and others argued that it was simply moralism and philosophical belief that drove these men. There were two initial plans. The first was the Virginia plan. As you can imagine, based on what I've already told you, the Virginia plan, written mostly by Edmund Randolph and James Madison, and as I mentioned, a number of the Pennsylvania delegates, including Ben Franklin, were heavily involved in the Virginia plan, was the first general plan for the Constitution. Its key points were bicameral legislature and an executive and judiciary chosen by that legislature. It called for a powerful central government with 3 branches, and it called for a 2-house legislature, one by the people, one chosen by the people, and one by the legislatures of the states. The New Jersey plan, on the other hand, created a framework for the Constitution that was more reflective of the beliefs of the small states. Its key points were a 1-house legislature with 1 vote, just like the Articles. A Congress with the ability to raise revenue, that was a little bit different. That strengthened and solved one of the problems of the Articles. And a Supreme Court with members appointed for life. They wanted to strengthen but not replace the Articles. In addition to what we've already said, the way that they wanted Congress to be able to raise revenue was through duties on imports and postal service fees rather than direct tax on people. They wanted, as I mentioned before, a Supreme Court appointed for life, but also appointed by the executive officer or officers. Constitutional compromises, as is the case in all of politics, the way that the Constitution was eventually formed was through a number of compromises. Some of the key ones. First of all, the Great Compromise. This was the final decision of the Constitutional Convention to create a two-house legislature with a lower house elected by the people, the House of Representatives, and with powers divided between the two houses. It also made national law supreme. The most serious disagreement between New Jersey and Virginia was representation in Congress, small states versus large. Connecticut was the state that actually offered the compromise. They wanted representation by population. Each state and an equal vote for each state, and then an equal vote in the upper house. Again, there was a stalemate. So ultimately, the compromise that gets adopted is a two-house legislature. The House of Representatives, initially there were only 56 members. That's changed by statute or law. The 56 members represented about 30,000 people each. That would be an untenable number of representatives if that were the case today. These people are directly elected by the people. Their power, and it's with them that the power to originate revenue bills that for raising and spending, revenue and spending, start with them. The Senate, each state had an equal vote. Eventually, they would agree on the number 2. So they would have 2 senators, and the representatives would be selected by the state legislatures. And obviously, this would eventually change by the 17th Amendment. The national government would be supreme under this compromised agreement that they eventually go for. That's called the Supremacy Clause. Another compromise that they had to make was on the issue of slavery, whether to have slavery be a part of the nation or not. And unfortunately, in order to get the Constitution done, the opposition to slavery had to relent in order to actually have the South agree to the Constitution. So it basically came down to Southern economic interests versus Northern competing interests, economic and otherwise. Eventually, you have this agreement, and the N means that the North agreed to Southern demands. The S means the opposite. The South agrees to Northern demands. Number one, the North agreed to consent to 20 more years of the slave trade. The North also agreed to a 20-year ban on taxing exports of cotton, thereby protecting the cotton industry in the South. The South, in return, agreed that only a simple majority vote would be needed on navigation laws, and that the national government's authority to regulate foreign commerce. They agreed to essentially the Commerce Clause. And then finally, the North agreed that 2/3 of the Senate would be necessary in order to ratify treaties. And the reason the South wanted that is because at the time, the South made up about 1/3 of the states, so they could block treaties that were against their interest. There was also another compromise that's a bit of a dark piece of our history, and that is the 3/5 compromise. So the question that they had was how to determine state populations for the purposes of the House of Representation, which was apportioned based on population. The number of seats you get depends on how many people are in the state. The southern states wanted to include the non-voting slaves because that would mean that they had more representation in Congress. The ultimate decision, the ultimate compromise that the North was willing to agree to was the 3/5 compromise, which said that for the purposes of determining apportionment of direct taxes and representation, you were to add 3/5 of all other persons, meaning slaves, to the whole number of free persons. This actually gives the South a huge portion of the House of Representations, 47%, meaning that they could protect slavery, but they couldn't foster the spread of slavery, which is going to cause conflicts later on. The executive branch. They agreed on a one, all of them agreed on a one person executive, but what they couldn't agree on was the length of the term or the selection process. With rebellion having just taken place, they feared giving too much power to the lower class, so they didn't necessarily want a direct election. Others feared allowing the legislature to select would put too much power in the hands of the large states, particularly in the Senate. So a committee was created known as the Committee on Unfinished Portions, and their goal was to iron out problems and disagreements concerning the executive. They agreed to a 4-year term rather than what had been proposed, a 7-year term. They also agreed to the electoral college system, in which each state would select electors equal to the number of representatives it had in the House and the legislature. So, for instance, if you had 15 members of the House, you would get 17 electors. That is the number of representatives in the House plus your 2 senators. The electors were to be people with adequate information, education, and experience to select the president. That comes from Federalist Number 68. They were supposed to be sort of an elite class of people who would make a wise decision when choosing the president. Removal of the president is also included in the Constitution. The way it worked, and we've already discussed this, but the House of Representatives investigated and charged the president or vice president with treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. If a majority vote took place, meaning they got one more than half, then they would send articles of impeachment, basically indictments, to the Senate. Once the articles of impeachment were sent to the Senate would hold the trial. That trial would be presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then a 2/3 vote in favor of removal. If everyone was there, that means there would need to be 67 pro votes. At that point, the president, vice president, or other official would be removed. They chose the Chief Justice to preside instead of the traditional presiding officer of the Senate, which would be the vice president, to avoid obvious conflicts of interest. And that's it for section 3. Remember to go and answer on Google Classroom in the Google form for your essential question comp check. What issues and compromises were central to the writing of the U.S. Constitution?